Hi, I'm Keon, a research analyst with Lipper, and I'm here to talk to you about fund flow activity for the week ended Wednesday, September 23rd. Overall for the week, we saw net aggregate inflows of approximately $8.6 billion. Money market funds were the largest contributor to these inflows as they took in $10.4 billion in net new money. Muni bond funds also contributed somewhat with net inflows of roughly $230 million. For net outflows, we saw equity funds having the largest with approximately $2 billion, while taxable bond funds also saw about $33 million leave their coffers. Let's take a quick look at the market activity now. Last week, both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 Index were off about 3%. Both of these indices were hurt by the Federal Reserve's decision to leave interest rates unchanged. The main reason behind the Fed's decision was continued concerns about China's economy, while a secondary factor was also the U.S. inflation rate being well below the 2% target that had been set for it. All right, let's turn our attention back now to the fund flow activity. Looking at the macro groups for this week, we see that equity mutual funds took in $2.9 billion in net new money. Taxable bond funds had net outflows of roughly $1.4 billion. Muni bond funds took in $322 million in net new money, while money market funds had $10.4 billion in net inflows for the week. Let's take a closer look at our equity mutual fund group now. The $2.9 billion in net inflows broke a string of 5 straight weekly net outflows for the group, during which time they saw $8.2 billion leave. Amongst the big players last week, non-domestic equity funds once again had net inflows as they took in $2.2 billion on the week. And while domestic equity funds somewhat more muted, $700 million in net inflows, better than they have been doing lately, where we've been seeing a lot of net outflows for the group. For the year to date, non-domestic equity funds have roughly $100 billion in net inflows, while domestic equity funds have seen $80 billion leave their coffers. For non-domestic equity funds, the largest classification group, the group with the largest net inflows, has been international multi-cap core funds, which have taken in just over $65 billion. And the largest player within that group has been the Vanguard Total International Stock Index Fund with about $49 billion in net inflows. Let's turn our attention to equity ETFs now. For the week, the group saw $4.9 billion leave their coffers. As the chart indicates, the chief player here was the Spider S&P 500 ETF, which saw $8.3 billion leave. On the buy side, we see the iShares MSCI Emerging Markets taking in about $1 billion in net new money, and the iShares Russell 2000 ETF had about $490 million in net inflows last week. Let's move on to the taxable bond funds group now. We'll start with the mutual funds. They had net outflows of $1.4 billion on the week. This is their 9th consecutive week of outflows, during which time they've seen about $20 billion leave their coffers. It's been a rough third quarter for taxable bond funds. They've had about $43 billion in net outflows overall for the quarter, which brings their year-to-date total to net outflows of roughly $20 billion. If this trend continues and the taxable bond fund group finishes with net outflows for the year, it will mark the first time since the year 2000 that they have annual net outflows. All right, let's move on now to the ETF side for taxable bond funds. For the week, they took in $1.3 billion in net new money. This marks the sixth consecutive week of net inflows for the group, during which time they've taken in about $16 billion in new money. On the buy side was the iShares 20-plus year Treasury product, which had about $410 million in net inflows, followed by the iShares iBoxx High Yield, which took in about $210 million. As the chart shows, the outflows were somewhat muted and spread out. Nothing really significant for one ETF last week. Let's move on to our next category now, the Muni Bond Fund Group. As stated previously, they had $322 million in net inflows last week. This broke a string of 4 consecutive weeks of net outflows for the group. Chief national muni funds took in roughly $338 million last week, while single state munis saw $16 million leave. Our last group to talk about today is money market funds. Money market funds had $10.4 billion in net inflows last week. This broke a string of 3 straight weekly net outflows for the group, which they saw almost $30 billion leave their coffers. Among Amongst the groups taking in the most money last week was institutional money market funds, which had $13 billion in net inflows for the week. Well, that wraps up this week's report. If you'd like to take a deeper dive with the data, please join us at our website, www.lipperusfundflows.com, and please join us here again next week where another one of our analysts will be speaking about that week's fund flows activity.